I'm going to invite you just to take one of those breaths that Paula was talking about, all the way in, and hold it and thank God for it, and then let it out. And take another one in and out. On Monday, the nation celebrated our veterans. Any veterans here today? You've served our country with honor and dignity. You've stood for democracy and against tyranny and to keep the world free from fear. And we are deeply grateful for your service. I come from a line of military veterans. I'm proud of them all and for the sacrifices each one made for peace and for the hope for peace to last. It began as Armistice Day, that day in 1918, marking the end of the war that would end all wars, when German and Allied weapons were laid down and the whole world breathed a sigh of relief that peace had come and war was over and we would never, ever, 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 ever experience that terror again. 106 years later, war is ongoing. Acts of terror are commonplace. In fact, Pope Francis has called terrorism a piecemeal World War III. Terrorism isn't just about bombs or geopolitics or war in other places that don't particularly touch our everyday lives. The classic definition of terrorism is this: the unlawful use of violence and intimidation, especially against civilians, in the pursuit of political aims. If I was Merriam-Webster, I'd expand it to say that terrorism is any concerted attack on another person or persons meant to cause panic or foster fear or do violence or intimidate. Terrorism arises from extreme responses to shifts in culture or politics or social issues or faith, and gives birth to violence of all kinds. It's evident in hate and division rhetoric that we hear launched every single day here at home by persons who call themselves Christian. It is actually stunningly possible to hear people in this country talking about making actual war on each other within our borders, as if this is normal civic conversation. And we hear its effects expressed in the ever-increasing use of the word fear when politics or culture is mentioned. Have you been hearing that word a lot lately? Fear infiltrates the public sphere, fills the air we breathe. It's not the figment of a snowflake's imagination. It isn't the fantasy of the woke. The world is a much scarier place than it once might have been because fear has invaded our peace and killed the bits of innocence we may have had left. And what is utterly horrifying is how often it has done so in the name of religion or nationalism or both. So what exactly is the Jesus response to extremism in all its forms? What's the Jesus response to fear? It's a question we should train ourselves to ask more often, particularly when we feel overwhelmed, particularly when we're taking those deep breaths we need so badly. It's a question that these children we've baptized today will need an answer for as they grow up in this world. You have promised today to help them find the answer to fear when it touches their lives. Jesus gives us an answer in this gospel. When you hear of wars and rumored wars, keep your head and don't panic. This is routine history. It is no sign of the end. Nation will fight nation, and ruler fight ruler over and over and over. Fighting words and fractious times originate in fear and in panic, and for many, way too many, they grow into a desire for revenge. Revenge for cultural change, or for perceived slights, or for losses, or mistakes, or whatever. And it's not new. Jesus says that all of that is always with us. People will always be people, vulnerable to fear and worry and anxiety and hate and rage and revenge. But pick a gospel, any gospel, read it through, and you cannot escape the fact that Jesus says to love those who hate us, and those who persecute us, and those who terrorize us. Fear is not our home, and revenge is not our purpose. Love is. The temple coming down, this thing that Jesus mentions to his disciples as they're staring at the temple, that edifice coming down was a terrifying, panic-inducing thought for Jesus' disciples and for all the Jews, all who would hear him, all who were faithful in the temple. Losing the temple is unthinkable. They've lost it before, generations before, and to lose it again is incomprehensible. Their anxiety rises as they consider it, so much so that when they get across the valley to the Mount of Olives, 4 of Jesus' friends pull him aside and say, you've got to tell us what you meant by that. But Jesus isn't really talking about the temple. Not really. He's talking about the fact that all the shrines we make to all the ways we create God in our own imperfect images will fall. The cathedrals we build to house our own prejudices and hatreds will topple. Anything we build to enshrine our self-image will crumble. It's not what we build, but what God builds that will stand. And because it's Mark's gospel, the disciples don't get it yet. Jesus opens up for them a reality in which imperfect people reconcile with God. And he offers a glimpse of life at one with God and God's dream for the world. He teaches again and again that God's will is not found in laws or propositions or proposals or preferences or war or violence or terror or greed for power or whatever temples we build for ourselves. The incarnation of love as flesh and bone is the way that God writes God's will into the world. Jesus shows us our need for God and shows us what is possible when we choose God's love-centered life. Jesus' point is that we don't dictate how God works. That's not up to us. God dictates how God works, and God's work is always love. Most of us get it wrong now and then because we lace love with our own stuff. Many of us get it spectacularly wrong, and we break things. Our relationships with other people, our lives, our stability. And there are some who focus so much on our own agendas or preferences, our own fears and struggles, that we forget to listen for God's agenda. And worse, we forget what love looks like. To act from fear, whether with weapons or hate speech or terrorism, or on the other side of the equation with panic and inaction and silence, To act either of those ways is to take the path of least resistance. It's to give in to the things that Jesus was trying so hard to free us from. But when Christianity has been weaponized and nationalized, when self-named Christians are promising hate and harm, it is hard not to be afraid. It is hard to know what to do and to know how and whether to fight back. It's hard to shift to a center of love and trust that this is always the right thing. It is hard to see a path forward through fear. Our faith teaches us to do the very difficult work of forgiveness of our enemies and to put aside our tendency toward warmongering and hatred. That's what it is to be about the work of Christ. That's the path forward, as difficult as it may sound and seem. That's the counterterrorism measure. Viktor Frankl once wrote, "Forces beyond your control can take away everything you possess except one thing: your freedom to choose how you will respond to a situation." Fear is a choice. Somebody said that to me walking out of the first service this morning. Now, just for a minute, I'm going to take a little detour, a little side trip, and note that the work of writing sermons is not always straightforward. You think you know where you're going, you're convinced you know where you're going, and sometimes the Spirit interferes, as she does. All week long, as I've been pondering what to say and how, I've been drawn to a book on my shelf. If I'm sitting at imagine me, I'm sitting at my desk, and there's a shelf right there. There are shelves all around me. That is an amazing office. Anyway, there's a shelf right there. I've been drawn to a book on my shelf that I have not looked at in years except to pack and unpack. And to one story in that book I half remembered that kept finding center space in my thoughts this week. Evidently, it wants to be heard, and so here it is. The book is called Angels in Red Suspenders by Ralph Milton. And he writes this reflection on danger and fear. The whole thing got blown to smithereens. And a good thing, too, because it contained dangerous goods, subversive stuff, explosive materials. The folks in the neighborhood around Erskine Presbyterian Church in Hamilton, Ontario, called the bomb squad. There was a mysterious package on the front steps of the church, and it had been sitting there for 12 hours. It didn't seem to have any identifying marks. No telling what it contained. No wonder the neighbors got twitchy and called the cops. They were good neighbors, and they did the right thing. The bomb squad came and tried to x-ray the ominous-looking bundle, but that didn't work. So, only one thing to do: bring in the bazookas and blow the thing up. Bam! When the last piece of paper floated to the ground, they discovered what it was. Curriculum. Church school curriculum. Called The Whole People of God, from a company called Woodlade Books. The courier had delivered it early in the morning, dropped it label down on the steps, and left. The bomb squad did the right thing. I know that curriculum, he writes. I know that curriculum pretty well, even had a hand in publishing it. And blowing it sky high is the only proper way to dispose of it. It's full of subversive ideas, like love your enemies. And love is more important than power. And be fair to each other, especially the folks who are at the bottom of the heap. And it is better to give than to receive. And justice shall flow like a river. Ideas like that should be blown to smithereens, because if people ever took them seriously, they'd turn the world upside down. Jesus' message is about the choices we make when we live that life as imperfect people who have found perfect love. Hate rises and falls. Wars come and go. Edifices are built and crumble. Jesus is asking his disciples and us to notice what is most important and to put our trust and our hope there. He's asking us not to give in to despair and fear, or as one of you said in an email to me this week, staying calm is a form of resistance. We have choices to make in our lives of faith, to hate, to spread terror and fear and panic are not choices born of God. To have God's love-centered life written in our hearts, which then cannot hate or murder or create fear, even when we are hated or persecuted first. To have that love-centered life in our hearts is the choice that we're called to make. Our preferences for the easy road of revenge and retaliation, our preferences for the world as we want it to be instead of the world as it is, are not compatible with a life of faith or with our purpose as disciples of the Christ. It's not easy to keep that life and purpose central, particularly when the panic is rising or when we feel powerless or hopeless. But Jesus never said that life would be easy, especially when we are afraid. But it is the life that leads to life. It is the life that will turn a world of hate upside down. And that is good news. Thanks be to God for it. Amen.
Amen.